Virgin Mountain Man lived alone for 20 years, until 7 rejected brides came asking for shelter. For 2 decades, a giant of a man hid away in the high mountains, untouched by love, untouched by family. His world was nothing but silence, snow, and the crackle of fire. But one stormy night, the pounding of wagon wheels shattered the stillness, and 7 broken-hearted women stood at his door. They'd been cast aside, shamed in public, with nowhere to go. He thought he was giving them a roof for one night. Instead, he inherited 7 shattered lives. And the town? It spat on them. The preacher thundered against them. And the railroad? It wanted the only water keeping them alive. Yet inside that little shack, something impossible was happening. Songs by the fire, prayers whispered through tears, and a man who'd never known love suddenly standing taller than he ever had before. But can one mountain man, who has never even held a bride, protect 7 outcasts against a whole town and the railroad's greed? Or will mercy cost him everything he owns, including his last chance at a family? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late autumn wind whistled through the Colorado highlands as Jedediah Kane's axe bit deep into another log. His massive shoulders flexed with each swing, the steady rhythm matching the prayers he muttered under his breath. The tall pines around his cabin swayed, their branches creaking as storm clouds rolled in from the west, promising the season's first heavy snow. "Lord," he whispered between strokes, "show me your purpose." The words disappeared into the gathering dusk, same as they had nearly every evening for 20 years. Splitting the last log, Jedediah gathered the wood in his arms, the rough bark catching on his wool shirt. His boots crunched through frost-covered grass as he made his way to the cabin. The familiar scent of pine sap and wood smoke wrapped around him, a comfort against the approaching storm. Inside his cabin, everything had its place, neat, ordered, sparse. An iron cooking pot hung above the hearth. His few books lined a rough-hewn shelf. His father's old Bible lay open on the table, its pages worn smooth from years of searching. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and Jedediah added wood to the flames, watching sparks spiral up the stone chimney. The silence pressed in, heavy as a wool blanket. He'd grown used to it over the years, learned to wrap himself in it like armor. But lately, that silence had started feeling less like protection and more like a prison. The sudden bark of his dogs shattered the evening quiet. Jedediah's head snapped up, his body tensing. The hounds rarely barked without cause. Bears sometimes ventured close, or the occasional mountain lion. But this was different. Their barking held more excitement than warning. Then he heard it, the grinding of wagon wheels, the clink of harness, voices carried on the wind. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In these conditions, with snow threatening, they were nearly unheard of. Jedediah grabbed his lantern and stepped onto his porch, holding it high. The yellow light cut through the gathering gloom, illuminating a sight that stopped him cold. A wagon stood in his yard, its canvas top sagging with moisture. But it wasn't the wagon that made his breath catch. It was its passengers. 7 women huddled together, their dresses mud-spattered, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They clutched carpetbags and small bundles, like they carried everything they owned. One woman stood slightly apart from the others, her spine straight despite her obvious weariness. Something in her bearing marked her as their leader. "Sir," she said, stepping forward. Her voice was clear and steady, though Jedediah could see her hands trembling as she gripped her bag. "I'm Mary Beth Caldwell. We've traveled far, and we find ourselves in desperate need of shelter." Jedediah shifted uncomfortably, feeling the rough wood of his porch railing under his calloused hands. He'd gone weeks sometimes without speaking to another soul. Now, 7 women stood in his yard, looking at him with tired, hopeful eyes. His throat felt thick as old honey. "Ma'am," he managed finally, the word coming out gruff. "There's a town, 30 miles south." "We've come from there," Mary Beth interrupted, her composure cracking slightly. "We were. We were promised husbands, mail-order brides, all of us. But when we arrived, she swallowed hard, lifting her chin. The men took one look at us and decided we weren't what they wanted. They left us there, stranded. One of the younger women let out a small sob, quickly stifled. Another shivered violently, her thin shawl offering little protection against the biting wind. Jedediah saw tears frozen on her cheeks. "Please," Mary Beth continued, "we have nowhere else to go. The storm's coming in fast. We just need shelter for the night." Jedediah's mind raced. His cabin was small, barely big enough for him. Having 7 women inside would be like trying to fit a month's worth of supplies in a day pack. And he'd never been comfortable around women. Their presence made him feel like a bear in a china shop. Too big, too rough, too likely to break something delicate. But then the young woman shivered again, wrapping her arms around herself, and Jedediah thought of his father's voice reading from the Bible. "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was a stranger, and you invited me in." "Come in," he said abruptly, stepping aside. "It ain't much, but it's warm." Relief washed over Mary Beth's face. "Thank you, mister." "Cain," he supplied. Jedediah Cain. He helped them unload their belongings, careful not to touch the women as they filed past him into the cabin. Their skirts brushed against his rough furniture, their presence immediately changing the feel of the space he'd inhabited alone for so long. The air seemed different somehow, filled with the rustle of fabric and quiet breathing instead of his usual solitude. The women gravitated to the hearth like moths to flame, holding their hands out to the warmth. Jedediah added more wood, watching from the corner of his eye as they settled on the floor, too exhausted to care about proper seating. Their faces glowed in the firelight, showing every line of weariness, every shadow of disappointment. Mary Beth remained standing, her eyes taking in the cabin's sparse furnishings. "We won't impose on you longer than necessary, Mr. Cain. As soon as the storm passes, you'll do what needs doing, when it needs doing," Jedediah interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Storm might last days. No sense making plans till we see what morning brings." He busied himself pulling out every blanket he owned, which wasn't many. The women thanked him softly as he distributed them, their manners intact despite their circumstances. One of them, he hadn't caught her name, tried to refuse, saying he'd need it himself. "Got my coat?" he said gruffly. "Used to cold." As the women settled, wrapped in blankets and huddled close to share warmth, Jedediah retreated to his straight-backed chair in the corner. He'd spend the night there, giving the women what little floor space his cabin offered. Sleep wasn't likely anyway, not with his home suddenly full of strangers. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Jedediah watched as, one by one, the women drifted into exhausted sleep. Only Mary Beth remained awake, her eyes reflecting the dying fire. She caught him looking and offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she whispered again. "Most men would have turned us away." Jedediah shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ain't right," he muttered. "Leaving women out in weather like this ain't Christian." "No," she agreed softly. "It isn't." She paused, studying him. "Do you live here alone, Mr. Cain?" 20 years now, he answered, surprised to find himself sharing the information. "Since my pa passed." Mary Beth nodded, something like understanding crossing her face. "It must be quite a shock, having your solitude invaded by 7 unexpected guests." Jedediah considered this, listening to the soft breathing of the sleeping women, the pop and crackle of the fire, the wind's moan outside. His usual evening prayers came back to him. His requests for purpose, for understanding of God's plan for his life. "Reckon the Lord works in mysterious ways," he said finally. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Mary Beth pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders, her eyes growing heavy. "Indeed he does, Mr. Cain. Indeed he does." Jedediah watched as she finally succumbed to sleep, her head drooping forward. The fire cast shadows across the room, turning his familiar cabin into something strange and new. 7 women, abandoned and desperate, seeking shelter in his home. The thought was still too big to fully grasp. He leaned back in his chair, preparing for his vigil. Outside, the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white. Jedediah's prayers that night were different from his usual ones. Instead of asking for purpose, he asked for guidance. Instead of seeking understanding, he sought wisdom. For 20 years he'd lived in solitude, convinced it was his destiny. Now, as he watched over his unexpected guests, he wondered if perhaps God had other plans. The thought both terrified and intrigued him, like standing at the edge of an unexplored valley, knowing the path ahead would change everything. The night deepened, and Jedediah Kane sat in his chair, a silent guardian over 7 sleeping women, while the Colorado winter howled outside his door. His life of solitude had shattered like spring ice on the river, and he had no idea what the new day would bring. All he knew was that somehow, in some way he couldn't yet understand, everything had changed. Morning crept into Jedediah's cabin like a timid creature, pale light filtering through the frost-painted windows. The glass panes had gathered delicate patterns overnight, nature's own lacework etched in ice. Jedediah had been awake for hours, having dozed only fitfully in his hard chair. His neck was stiff, but he moved quietly as he stirred the banked coals and added kindling to rebuild the fire. The coffee pot was one of his few luxuries, and he measured the grounds carefully, aware his usual portion would need stretching. The familiar ritual helped steady his hands as reality settled in. 7 women sleeping on his floor, their shapes huddled under borrowed blankets like scattered leaves. The coffee's aroma filled the cabin, rich and welcoming. One by one, the women began to stir. Mary Beth was first, smoothing her skirts as she rose. Her hair was mussed from sleep, but she quickly pinned it back into place, dignity returning with each practiced movement. "Good morning, Mr. Kane," she said softly, mindful of those still sleeping. "Might I help with breakfast?" Jedediah shook his head, pouring coffee into his few tin cups. "Ain't much to help with," he muttered. "Coffee's ready, though." The others wakened gradually, accepting cups with murmured thanks. They gathered near the hearth, shoulders touching as they shared the limited space. In the morning light, Jedediah could see them clearly for the first time. 7 different faces, each marked by worry and weariness, but each holding its own kind of strength. Mary Beth cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should make proper introductions." She gestured to a tall, practical-looking woman. "This is Eliza Grant." "Much obliged for the shelter," Eliza said, her voice carrying a hint of humor despite their circumstances. "Reckon you weren't expecting such a crowd." A younger woman, barely more than a girl, ducked, her head shyly. "I'm Ruth Miller," she whispered. "I'm not much good at anything, but I can learn." "Clara Jennings," said another, her bearing suggesting education and refinement. She held her coffee cup with perfect posture, as if at a society tea rather than sitting on a cabin floor. Abigail Turner?" stammered a small woman with worried eyes, her fingers twisting in her skirt. The next woman sat slightly apart, her dark hair and high cheekbones marking her heritage. "I am Dinah Redbird," she said, meeting Jedediah's eyes directly. "Cherokee, and a seamstress by trade." "And I'm Hattie Wilson," said the last, a woman with gentle eyes and silver threading her hair. "A widow, with a young son back east I'm hoping to send for." Each woman fell silent after speaking, as if the weight of their situations pressed down anew. Finally, Mary Beth spoke again, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "We should explain what happened in town." She paused, gathering strength. "We all answered advertisements for wives, paid our own way west, some of us selling everything we owned to make the journey. But when we arrived, weren't what they were expecting," Eliza cut in bluntly. "Too plain, too tall, too educated, too Indian, too widowed, too shy, too serious." Each man found his reason. "They just left us there," Ruth said, tears welling in her eyes. "Said we weren't suitable." Jedediah's hands tightened around his coffee cup, anger rising in his chest. Before he could speak, a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. The women startled like deer at a rifle shot. "Water," Jedediah said gruffly, standing. "Need to fetch it anyway." But when he opened the door, it wasn't just the morning chill that swept in. Reverend Silas Harper stood on the porch, two deacons flanking him like grim sentries. The preacher's face was thunderous. "Brother Cain," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "Word reached us that you're harboring women of questionable character." Jedediah felt heat rise in his neck. "Ain't harboring nothing but guests who needed shelter from the storm." "These women were rejected by God, fearing men for good reason," one deacon added. "Their presence here is unseemly." Through the open door, Jedediah could hear the women's movements cease, could feel their fear and shame like a physical thing. He thought of Ruth's tears, of Dinah's dignity, of Marybeth's quiet strength. "Reckon," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that any man who'd leave women stranded in winter ain't as God, fearing as he claims." The Reverend's face darkened. "You risk your reputation, Jedediah. People will talk. These women are—" "Under my roof," Jedediah interrupted, his voice firmer now, "and deserving of dignity same as any soul. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to fetch water." He pushed past them, bucket in hand, leaving them standing on his porch. His heart hammered against his ribs, unused to confrontation. But his step was steady as he made his way to the well. When he returned, the Reverend and his deacons were gone, but their presence lingered like frost on the window panes. The women sat in huddled silence, shame and uncertainty written across their faces. The day passed slowly. The women helped where they could, straightening the cabin's sparse furnishings, but mostly they kept to themselves, speaking in whispers if at all. Jedediah worked outside, splitting more wood, checking his stores, anything to keep his hands busy while his mind churned. As evening approached, he did what he could to make a proper meal. Beans simmered in their pot, and he mixed cornbread with practiced motions. It wasn't much, but it was hot and filling. They gathered around his rough table, some sitting on upturned boxes or logs he'd brought in. The only sounds were spoons against tin plates and the pop of the fire. The silence stretched tight as fiddle strings until suddenly, soft and clear, Hattie's voice rose in song. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." One by one, the other women joined in, their voices twining together like smoke rising from the chimney. Marybeth's strong alto, Clara's precise soprano, Dinah's rich tone adding depth to the familiar hymn. Even Abigail, who stumbled over speech, sang clear and true. Jedediah didn't sing. He'd never learned how. But something in his chest loosened as he listened. The cabin seemed to grow warmer, more alive with their voices. For the first time in more years than he could count, the silence that had been his constant companion gave way to something else, something that felt strangely like hope. When the hymn ended, the silence that followed was different, comfortable, shared. Marybeth caught his eye across the table and smiled slightly, a silent thank you for his earlier defense. Jedediah nodded once, then busied himself with clearing plates. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in town, tongues would be wagging. But inside his cabin, 7 women who had been deemed unsuitable found shelter, and a man who had lived 20 years alone found his solitude transformed by their presence. It wasn't proper, perhaps, by the Reverend's standards. But as Jedediah listened to the women begin another hymn, their voices rising like prayers in the gathering dark, he reckoned maybe proper wasn't always the same as right. The evening drew on, shadows growing long in the corners of the cabin. Yet for the first time in years, those shadows held no loneliness. Instead, they danced to the rhythm of women's voices raised in song, to the quiet sounds of people sharing space and breaking bread together. Jedediah sat in his chair by the fire, watching the faces illuminated by lamplight, and felt something shift in his soul, like spring ice breaking up on the river, making way for new possibilities. Morning came crisp and clear, the kind that made every breath visible in the cold air. Jedediah pulled his worn coat tighter as he headed toward town, his boots crunching through fresh snow. The list of needed supplies weighed heavy in his pocket: flour, lamp oil, and other basics that his unexpected guests required. The main street came into view, shop windows glinting in the early light. Already, he could feel the stares. Women gathered in twos and threes on the boardwalk parted as he passed, their whispers trailing behind him like shadows. There he goes, the one housing those rejected brides. Living in sin, if you ask me. Always knew there was something peculiar about that mountain man. Outside the saloon, 3 men lounged against the wall. One spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed deliberately close to Jedediah's boots. "Well, if it ain't the fool guarding leftovers," the man drawled, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Reckon you think you're doing the Lord's work, taking in them cast-offs?" Jedediah kept walking, his jaw tight. The men's laughter followed him down the street. The bell above the mercantile door jangled as he entered. Old Mr. Peterson barely looked up from his ledger, though Jedediah had traded with him for 20 years. The silence stretched uncomfortable as Jedediah gathered his supplies: flour in a rough burlap sack, lamp oil in a tin container, salt, coffee beans, and a few other necessities. As he waited for Mr. Peterson to total his purchases, voices drifted from the back room. 2 men in city clothes, railroad men, by their look stood over a map spread across a barrel. "Creek rights all through here," one was saying, his finger tracing a blue line. "Once we secure those water claims." "What about the mountain holdings?" the other interrupted. "That trapper, Kane. One signature or another, we'll get what we need." Jedediah's hands tightened on the counter. That creek had watered his stock and fed his garden for 2 decades. He forced himself to focus on counting out coins for his purchases, but his mind churned with this new worry. The walk home seemed longer, weighted down with supplies and concerns. But as his cabin came into view, something lightened in his chest. Smoke rose straight and true from the chimney, and he could hear voices, women's voices, drifting on the crisp air. He paused at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene. Eliza stood at his cook fire, stirring something that smelled better than anything he'd managed in years. Dinah sat on the porch, her nimble fingers working a needle through the worn sleeve of his spare coat. And Ruth. There was a resounding crack, followed by a yelp. Ruth stood by the chopping block, an axe awkwardly gripped in her hands, staring at a log that had rolled away completely intact. Her face burned red with frustration and embarrassment. "Sorry," she stammered. "I thought I wanted to help, but I can't seem to." Jedediah set down his supplies and walked over. Without a word, he picked up the escaped log and set it upright on the block. "Grip lower," he said quietly, demonstrating with his own hands on the axe handle. "Let the weight do the work, like this." The axe split the log clean through, the halves falling to either side. Ruth watched intently as he set up another. "Try again," he encouraged. Her first attempt glanced off, but she squared her shoulders and tried once more. This time, guided by his patient instruction, the log split with a satisfying crack. Ruth's face lit up with triumph. "I did it!" She beamed at the other women who had gathered to watch. "Did you see?" Eliza laughed warmly. "Well done, though I reckon we'd best not tell your mama you're wielding an axe like a lumberjack." "My mother would say it's not ladylike at all," Ruth admitted, but her smile didn't dim. "But it feels good, being useful." "There's dignity in honest work," Dinah said from the porch, her needle never stopping its steady motion. "No shame in learning new skills when needs must." One by one, the women drifted back to their tasks. Eliza returned to her stew, adding ingredients from Jedediah's stores with careful consideration. Dinah held up the mended coat, examining her neat stitches with a critical eye. Ruth continued practicing with the axe, each stroke becoming more confident. Jedediah carried his supplies inside, something warm and unfamiliar growing in his chest as he watched them work. These women, rejected and cast aside, were already bringing life to his sparse homestead. Where once there had been only silence, now there was the rhythm of work and quiet conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter. The day passed in a blur of activity. The women fell into natural roles, Eliza organizing the meager pantry, Dinah's clever fingers mending years of neglected clothes, Ruth proudly adding her split wood to the pile. The others found ways to help too, sweeping, washing, turning his bachelor cabin into something that felt more like a home. As dusk approached, Jedediah slipped outside. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and he needed space to think. He walked to the edge of his property where a fallen log served as his thinking spot. The night air was sharp with coming frost as he knelt in the snow. "Lord," he whispered, his breath clouding in the cold, "I don't rightly know if I'm doing what's proper." The townsfolk's whispers echoed in his mind, along with the railroad men's threatening words about the creek. He had lived so long alone, learning to be content with solitude. Now his quiet life had been upended by 7 women who looked to him for protection. "But," he continued, his rough voice soft in the darkness, "I reckon sometimes proper ain't the same as right." He thought of Ruth's proud smile when she split that log, of Dinah's quiet dignity as she worked, of Eliza's practical kindness in the kitchen. These women had been judged and found wanting by men who couldn't see their worth. Yet in just 2 days, they had brought more life and purpose to his homestead than he'd known in 20 years of solitude. Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed warm through the windows. Female voices drifted out, some talking, others humming as they prepared for sleep. He couldn't make out their words, but their tone was lighter than it had been that first night. What he didn't hear was their quiet conversation about him. "Did you see how patient he was, teaching me to split wood?" Ruth was saying as she helped lay out bedding. "Most men would have laughed at my first tries." "He's a kind soul," Eliza agreed, banking the fire for the night. "Rough as a bear on the outside, but gentle where it matters." "I wonder why he never married," Dinah mused, carefully folding her shawl. "A man with land, skills, and such a tender heart, surely there were women who would have had him?" "Perhaps he never found the right one," Mary Beth suggested. "Or perhaps God had other plans for him, like being here when 7 stranded women needed shelter." Outside, unaware of their words, Jedediah stood and brushed snow from his knees. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and constant as they had been all his solitary years. But tonight, something felt different. The shame he'd felt under the townspeople's stares was still there, but it was outweighed by something else, a quiet pride in doing what he knew to be right, regardless of others' judgment. He thought of the railroad men's threats about the creek, of the battles that might lie ahead, but those were worries for tomorrow. Tonight, there were women under his roof who needed protection and guidance, who brought with them the possibility of his homestead becoming something more than just shelter from the elements. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered to the stars, "for showing me purpose when I least expected it." With that prayer settling in his heart, he turned back toward the cabin. Light spilled from the windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering night. Inside, 7 women who had been deemed unsuitable by others were finding their worth in honest work and simple dignity. And a man who had thought himself destined for solitude was discovering that sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as responsibilities. For the first time in more years than he could count, Jedediah Kane felt truly at peace with his place in the world. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of rose and gold. Jedediah stood by his wagon, adjusting the harness on his team of horses while their breath steamed in the crisp morning air. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open as Mary Beth and Hattie emerged, wrapped warmly against the chill. "We're much obliged, Mr. Kane," Hattie said softly, clutching her shawl close. "The pantry's running mighty low." Jedediah nodded, extending his calloused hand to help each woman up onto the wagon seat. Their list of needed supplies was longer than his usual solitary requirements. Flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, and sundry items for 7 additional souls. The wooden wheels creaked as they set out, following the rutted trail toward town. The morning was quiet save for the steady clip-clop of hooves and the occasional call of a mountain jay. Mary Beth sat straight-backed between Jedediah and Hattie, her hands folded primly in her lap. The silence was comfortable until they approached the outskirts of town, where the first stirrings of daily life brought unwelcome attention. A group of women outside the milliner's shop turned their backs as the wagon passed, whispers following in its wake. The blacksmith, normally friendly, suddenly became very interested in his forge. Each cold shoulder and averted gaze struck like physical blows, though none of the wagon's occupants gave any sign of noticing. Near the general store, a cluster of boys lounging against a hitching post began to snicker. One of them, bold with youth and cruelty, called out loud enough for all to hear. "Look here, boys. 7 spares and they're giant. Guardian." The others joined in with jeers and catcalls. Mary Beth's shoulders stiffened, her spine going rigid with hurt pride. Without a word, Jedediah placed his large hand gently on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support and protection that spoke volumes. The steady warmth of his touch helped her hold her head high as they continued past. "Don't let them trouble you none," he said quietly, his deep voice barely carrying over the wagon's creak. "Ain't worth the breath they waste." Hattie dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It's kind of you to say, but hard not to feel the sting." They tied up the wagon and made their way toward the white-painted church that crowned the town's main street. Sunday services were about to begin, and townspeople filed in, carefully maintaining space around Jedediah and his charges as if they carried some invisible taint. Inside, the women followed Jedediah to the back pew, where they sat close together like birds huddling against a storm. The familiar sense of beeswax candles and old hymnals filled the air, but today they brought little comfort. As Reverend Silas took his place behind the pulpit, his stern gaze swept over the congregation before fixing on the group at the rear. His sermon started quietly enough, with traditional passages about virtue and righteousness. But soon his voice rose in righteous fury as he turned to the subject of households born of shame and the corruption of proper order. Though he named no names, his meaning was clear to all. "Those who harbor impropriety," he thundered, "who mock the sacred bonds of marriage with irregular arrangements, bring darkness upon us all." The women kept their eyes down, shoulders hunched under the weight of his words. But Jedediah sat straight, his weathered face impassive, meeting the Reverend's gaze steadily whenever it fell upon him. When the service ended, he rose without waiting for the final blessing and escorted his charges out, his broad shoulders, shielding them from stares as they made their exit. The ride home was subdued, the wagon now loaded with supplies but hearts heavy with fresh wounds. The women worked together to unload and store their purchases, moving with quiet efficiency born of shared purpose and pain. As evening approached, Eliza and Clara prepared a simple supper, while the others set the table a routine that was already becoming familiar in their strange household. The meal began in silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Then Clara, who had been watching Jedediah with thoughtful eyes, gathered her courage to speak. "Mr. Kane," she said softly, "might I ask you something personal?" Jedediah looked up from his stew, surprise flickering across his features. He nodded slowly. We've all wondered," Clara continued, choosing her words carefully, "why you never married. A man with land and skills such as yours." The question hung in the air. Jedediah set down his spoon, his large hands folding together as he considered his answer. When he spoke, his voice was low and halting, as if unused to sharing such private thoughts. "My mother," he began. "She passed when I was just a boy. Fever took her one hard winter." He paused, memories clouding his eyes. "My pa, he changed after that. Grew hard, taught me the mountains were the only companion a man could count on." The women listened intently, their own meals forgotten. Jedediah's gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. "Raised me to be self-sufficient. Said it was better than risking heartbreak." His rough fingers traced patterns on the wooden table. "By the time I was grown, I knew more about tracking game than talking to folks. This lonely shack," he gestured at the cabin walls. "No woman ever wished to share it. Can't say as I blame them." Mary Beth's hand moved as if to reach for his, then settled back in her lap. The simple honesty of his words touched something deep in each of them. They saw him now not as the intimidating mountain man who had taken them in, but as someone who had known his own share of rejection and loss. Ruth cleared her throat softly. "My grandmother used to say that comfort comes in many forms," she said. "She taught me a hymn when I was small one, about finding peace in unexpected places. Might we share it?" The other women nodded, and Ruth began to sing in a trembling voice. One by one they joined in, their voices blending in the ancient words of comfort. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." The familiar melody filled the cabin, soft and tremulous at first, then growing stronger. Jedediah listened, his face softening as the women's voices twined together in harmony. When they reached the second verse, he attempted to join in, his deep bass uncertain but earnest. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come." The hymn faded into silence, but something had shifted in the room. The women looked at Jedediah with new understanding, seeing past his rough exterior to the gentle soul beneath. And Jedediah, who had lived so long in solitude, felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest, a sense of belonging he had almost forgotten was possible. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. But inside the cabin, the silence that followed the hymn was filled not with loneliness, but with the quiet comfort of shared understanding and growing trust. Hattie reached for the coffee pot, refilling cups with practiced grace. "Well," she said softly, "seems to me the Lord knows what he's about, bringing folks together who need each other." Jedediah ducked his head, embarrassed by the sentiment but not disagreeing. The women exchanged knowing glances, touched by his innocence and sincerity. In that moment, they were no longer just 7 rejected brides and their reluctant protector. They were becoming something more, something like family. The evening continued with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of dishes being cleared. Outside, the stars began to appear, bright and clear in the mountain sky, witnessing the subtle strengthening of bonds that would need to weather many storms ahead. Heavy snow blanketed the Colorado highlands, transforming Jedediah's homestead into a pristine white wilderness. The flakes fell thick and steady, muffling all sound except the rhythmic thunk of his axe as he split wood for the ever-hungry stove. Inside the cabin, warmth and activity had replaced the old silence of his solitary life. Days settled into a gentle rhythm, as natural as breathing. Each morning, Jedediah would shoulder his rifle and venture into the white-draped forest, tracking rabbit trails in the fresh powder. The women, no longer awkward guests but becoming something more, found their own ways to contribute to their shared survival. In the kitchen corner, Eliza and Clara took turns tending the perpetual soup pot, adding whatever Jedediah brought home to create hearty meals that filled both belly and spirit. The scent of rabbit, stew, and cornbread often mingled with the pine smoke curling from the chimney, making the cabin feel more like home with each passing day. Dinah sat by the window, where the winter light fell strongest. Her skilled fingers worked steadily with leather and sinew, crafting moccasins for everyone in the household. She had noticed how the women's town boots were ill-suited for the deep snow and slippery paths around the cabin. "These will keep your feet warm and sure," she explained, demonstrating the traditional Cherokee stitching pattern that made the footwear both beautiful and durable. "My grandmother taught me that every stitch should be a prayer for the wearer's path." Ruth watched everything with eager attention, determined to learn the skills needed for mountain life. Each morning found her at the woodpile, practicing with smaller logs, until her hands blistered and her arms ached. Jedediah noticed her persistence but said nothing, merely leaving a pot of pine tar salve where she would find it. "Much obliged," she told him softly at supper that evening, showing him her bandaged palms. "But I aim to keep at it until I get it right." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Took me near a month to split my first chord proper. You're learning faster than I did." The days grew shorter, and the nights drew the household closer together. One evening, as wind howled outside and snow tapped against the windows, they gathered around the lamplit table after supper. The warm light cast soft shadows on the log walls, and the fire crackled low in the stove, creating an atmosphere that invited confidence. Hattie was the first to speak, her fingers absently twisting her wedding ring. "My Thomas," she began, her voice tender with memory. "He was a good man. Worked the silver mines up near Silverton. We had 3 fine years together before the cave-in." She paused, gathering strength. "Folks said I should count myself lucky the company paid fair compensation. But how do you put a price on a heart?" The others listened in respectful silence as she continued. "When I started receiving calls from suitors, I thought perhaps God was giving me another chance. But each one turned away when they learned about my boy." Her smile was sad but not bitter. "Said they didn't want to raise another man's child." "Their loss," Jedediah said quietly, surprising them all. "A child's a blessing, no matter whose blood runs in their veins." Hattie's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "Thank you kindly, Mr. Kane. That means more than you might know." Abigail sat with her hands clasped tight in her lap, gathering courage. When she spoke, her stammer was pronounced, each word requiring careful effort. I was to marry the banker's son in Ohio." Her cheeks flushed pink with the effort of speaking. He laughed when I tried to say my vows in practice. Said he couldn't have a wife who couldn't speak proper in society." Ruth reached over and covered Abigail's trembling hands with her own. Dinah's dark eyes flashed with indignation. "Some men's hearts are harder than stone," she said firmly. "They cannot see the beauty in gentle spirits." Jedediah shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the emotions filling his cabin but unwilling to withdraw. "Reckon some folk mistake a quiet voice for a weak one," he offered. "Been my experience that the softest words often carry the most truth." Abigail's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "You're too kind, Mr. Kane." Dinah sat straight-backed in her chair, dignity wrapped around her like a shawl. "In my case," she said, her voice steady, "the men made their objections plain enough. They said a Cherokee woman wasn't fit for a proper household." Her fingers traced the beadwork at her collar. "Even those who admired my skills as a seamstress couldn't see past my blood. One man told me outright he feared his children would look too Indian." The cabin grew very quiet. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Jedediah's large hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with suppressed anger. "Ain't right," he said finally, his deep voice rough with emotion. "A person's worth ain't in their bloodline or their way of speaking. It's in here." He tapped his chest awkwardly. "In how they treat others, in what they give to them that need help." He looked around the table at each woman in turn, his gaze steady and sincere. "None of you got cause for shame. Not a one. Them that turned you away, they're the ones ought to be ashamed." The women absorbed his words like parched earth drinking rain. Mary Beth wiped her eyes with her apron, and Clara reached out to squeeze Dinah's hand. Even Ruth, usually quick with a response, sat silent, touched by the simple truth in Jedediah's statement. Later that night, after the others had settled into their bedrolls, Jedediah sat in his usual chair by the dying fire. Sleep eluded him, his mind full of the stories he'd heard. The sound of soft weeping drew his attention to the corner where Abigail slept. He remained still, not wanting to embarrass her, but couldn't help overhearing her whispered prayer. "Lord, if it be your will, let this be a home without scorn. Let us find peace here, where we needn't hide our hurts." Something caught in Jedediah's throat. He thought of how empty the cabin had been just weeks ago, how he'd prayed for purpose while chopping wood in the gathering dusk. Now, watching the firelight play across the sleeping forms of these wounded but resilient women, he realized God had answered that prayer in an unexpected way. The cabin was no longer just shelter from the storm. These walls that had witnessed so much loneliness were now holding something precious, the first tentative bonds of family, formed not from blood, but from shared understanding and mutual respect. Jedediah added his own silent prayer to Abigail's, asking for wisdom to be worthy of the trust these women had placed in him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of peace, while inside, 7 rejected hearts and 1 solitary soul found themselves becoming something new and wonderful. A family born not of convention but of compassion. He watched over them until the fire burned down to embers, a quiet guardian of their growing trust. In the stillness of the night, with only the soft breathing of his charges and the occasional pop of the stove for company, Jedediah Kane felt more at peace than he had in all his years of solitude. The snow drifted past the windows, and the mountain winds sang their ancient songs, but within the cabin's walls, something beautiful was taking root. A sense of belonging that no amount of town gossip or social convention could diminish. Each woman's story had become a thread in a tapestry of shared experience, and Jedediah found himself woven into its pattern, no longer standing apart, but an essential part of this unlikely family. The morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally breaking after days of relentless snow. Sunlight sparkled on white-laden branches, and the air held that special crispness that comes after a long winter storm. Jedediah stood on his porch, studying the sky with practiced eyes while adjusting the straps on his fur-laden pack. "Looks like the weather's giving us a chance," he called over his shoulder into the cabin. "Best make our run to town while we can." Eliza emerged first, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. Her practical nature showed in the way she immediately began checking the wagon's wheels for ice buildup. Dinah followed, her dark hair neatly braided, carrying a bundle of mended clothes for trade. "Those furs should fetch a fair price," Eliza said, eyeing the stack of pelts Jedediah had prepared. "Beaver and fox, ain't they?" Jedediah nodded, lifting the heavy bundle into the wagon bed. "And 2 wolf pelts from that pair that was troubling the sheep last month. Ought to be enough for supplies to see us through till spring thaw." The 3 worked in comfortable silence, loading the wagon with trade goods. The other women gathered at the door to wave them off, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. Mary Beth called out a list of needed items, while Clara reminded them about lamp oil. The wagon creaked as it rolled through the fresh snow, following the path Jedediah had broken earlier with his snowshoes. Eliza sat beside him on the driver's bench, while Dinah arranged herself among the furs in the back, spreading a blanket across her lap. "Sure is peaceful," Eliza remarked, watching the sun catch ice crystals in the air. "Almost makes a body forget about town gossip." Jedediah grunted in agreement, though his shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of town. The last few visits had been difficult, with sideways glances and whispered comments following them through the streets. They reached town by mid-morning, the wagon's runners leaving fresh tracks in the unmarked snow of the main street. A few people were out, hurrying between buildings with collars turned up against the cold. Some nodded cautiously to Jedediah, while others turned away, pretending not to see the wagon or its occupants. At the mercantile, Jedediah helped both women down, then began unloading the furs. The shop bell tinkled as they entered, and old Mr. Peterson looked up from his ledger. His expression was neutral, but not unkind. "Morning, Mr. Kane." "Ladies," he nodded to each in turn. "Brought some furs for trade, I see?" "That we have," Jedediah replied, laying the bundle on the counter, "and a list of supplies needed." While Peterson examined the pelts, Eliza and Dinah moved through the store, gathering items from Mary Beth's list. The familiar routine was interrupted by the shop door opening, bringing with it a blast of cold air and the imposing figure of Mr. Brackett, the railroad agent. Brackett was a tall man in an expensive coat, with a watch chain that caught the light as he moved. His smile never quite reached his eyes as he approached the counter where Jedediah stood. "Mr. Kane," he said smoothly, reaching into his coat. "Just the man I wanted to see. I have some papers here that might interest you." Jedediah's expression didn't change, but his hand stilled on the counter. "That so?" Brackett spread several official-looking documents across the counter, partially covering the furs. "These are legal claims to the water rights along Cedar Creek. Your creek, specifically." His smile widened slightly. "The railroad requires that water for the new expansion. Progress, you understand." "That creek's been mined since 1863, Jedediah said quietly. "Got the deed to prove it." "Ah." But these new ordinances supersede previous claims. Brackett tapped the papers with one gloved finger. For the greater good of the territory's development. Dinah and Eliza had drawn closer, listening intently. Jedediah straightened to his full height, towering over the railroad agent. "Show me proof these papers are proper," he demanded, his voice low but firm. "Show me the governor's seal." Brackett's smile turned to a smirk. "All in good time, Mr. Kane. All in good time." He gathered the papers back into his coat. "But I'd start thinking about where else you might water your stock. The claim will be enforced." The threat hung in the air like frost. Brackett touched the brim of his hat and left, the shop bell ringing cheerfully behind him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "That man's been making similar claims all up and down the valley," he said quietly. "Some folks already sold out rather than fight." Jedediah nodded grimly and turned back to their trading. They completed their business in silence, loading the supplies into the wagon with careful efficiency. The return journey began under a cloud of worry, despite the bright winter sun overhead. They were halfway home when Eliza finally spoke, her voice tight with concern. "We're making things harder for you, ain't we? All of us showing up, using your resources, and now this trouble with the creek." "Don't start that kind of thinking," Dinah interrupted firmly from the wagon bed. "Mr. Kane chose to help us out of mercy, not obligation. The railroad would be after that water, whether we were there or not." Jedediah kept his eyes on the trail but nodded. "Dinah's right. You ladies ain't to blame for a railroad man's greed." "But what are we going to do?" Eliza persisted. "That creek's our only water source. Without it, we'll figure something," Jedediah said, his voice determined. "I gave you all my word you'd have a home here, and I mean to keep it." The rest of the journey passed in thoughtful silence. When they arrived at the cabin, women rushed out to help unload, but their excitement faded quickly as Eliza and Dinah shared the news about Brackett's visit. "But he can't just take the water, can he?" Clara asked, wringing her hands. "Not if you've got proper rights to it." "The railroad's been known to make its own rules," Marybeth said grimly. "Seen it happen back east." Abigail began to stammer more pronouncedly in her distress. "What will we do without water?" "Now, don't get yourselves all worked up," Jedediah said, though his own heart was unsettled. "Man's just trying to frighten us into selling cheap. We've got right on our side." But the evening meal was a somber affair, with worried glances exchanged over bowls of stew. The usual comfortable chatter was replaced by long silences and half-finished sentences. As they were clearing the dishes, Dinah stood suddenly. "Among my people," she said, her voice clear and strong, "we give thanks for what we have, even in times of trouble. Would you all join me in a blessing?" The others looked up, surprised but interested. Jedediah nodded encouragingly. Dinah moved to the center of the room and raised her hands slightly. She began to speak in Cherokee, the melodic words flowing like water. After each phrase, she translated, "We give thanks for this shelter that holds us. We give thanks for the fire that warms us. We give thanks for the food that sustains us. We give thanks for the water that lives in the creek. We give thanks for the hearts that beat as one family." She taught them a simple response in Cherokee, Wado, meaning thank you, and led them through the blessing again. This time, everyone joined in with the response after each line, their voices growing stronger with each repetition. The blessing seemed to lift something heavy from the room. Hattie's young son, who had been quiet all evening, began to practice saying Wado with great concentration. Ruth and Clara smiled at his efforts, and even Abigail's stammer eased as she joined in. Jedediah watched it all from his chair by the fire, his large hands clasped together. The worry about Brackett in the creek hadn't disappeared, but Dinah's blessing had reminded them all of what they did have, each other, and the strength that came from standing together. As the women prepared for bed, laying out their bedrolls and arranging blankets, the cabin felt warm with more than just fire heat. Dinah's blessing hung in the air like a shield against fear. And though tomorrow would bring its own challenges, tonight they were family, gathering courage from their shared prayers and shared purpose. Jedediah took his usual position in his chair, watching over his unusual household as they settled for the night. The creek's voice came faintly through the cabin walls, its water singing the same song it had sung since he first built this home. He made a silent promise to both the water and his sleeping family. He would find a way to protect what was theirs, no matter what it took. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh snow as Jedediah stood in the clearing behind his cabin, demonstrating how to set a wire snare. 7 pairs of eyes watched intently as his large hands, usually so clumsy with delicate tasks, moved with surprising grace. "See here," he explained, gesturing to the thin wire loop. "Rabbit runs along this path regular as Sunday service. You want to set the snare just high enough to catch round its neck when it passes through." Ruth Miller leaned forward, her face scrunched in concentration. She had volunteered to try first, eager despite her usual clumsiness. The others formed a half circle around her as she knelt in the snow, trying to mimic Jedediah's movements. "Like this?" she asked, fumbling with the wire. "Almost." Jedediah knelt beside her, his massive frame dwarfing her slight figure. "Here, hold it steady, like." His weathered hands guided hers, helping her position the snare properly. Marybeth and Clara exchanged knowing glances. They'd all noticed how patient the mountain man became when teaching Ruth, how his gruff manner softened when she struggled with new tasks. "There," he said, standing back. "Now we wait." Over the next few hours, Jedediah led them through the basics of tracking. He showed them how to spot rabbit droppings, identify bark stripped by deer, and read the stories written in disturbed snow. Dinah, drawing on her Cherokee knowledge, added insights about which plants animals preferred in winter. "Look here," she pointed to some scratches in the snow. "Grouse been digging for seeds." The women scattered through the clearing, practicing their new skills. Abigail discovered turkey tracks and called the others over, her usual stammer forgotten in her excitement. Eliza proved particularly adept at spotting the subtle signs of animal passage. "You ladies are taking to this better than I expected," Jedediah admitted, watching them work. His words carried no judgment, only honest appreciation. As the afternoon wore on, they checked Ruth's snare. Nothing yet. She tried to hide her disappointment, but Jedediah assured her it often took time. They set more snares together, each woman practicing until their fingers grew confident with the wire. The next morning, Ruth was first out the door to check the snares. Her shriek of delight brought everyone running. "I got one! I really got one!" She stood by her snare, pointing at the rabbit caught cleanly in the loop. Her face glowed with pride as Jedediah showed her how to properly retrieve and clean her catch. "Well done, Ruth," he said quietly, and her smile grew even brighter. The other women gathered around, offering congratulations. Even Hattie's young son clapped his hands in excitement. The celebration continued as they returned to the cabin, Ruth clutching her prize. "This calls for a proper feast," Marybeth declared. The women set to work with enthusiasm, preparing the rabbit with vegetables from their winter stores. Dinah taught them a Cherokee method of roasting meat over the open hearth, while Clara kneaded dough for fresh bread. The cabin filled with warmth and savory smells. Jedediah sat in his usual chair, watching the scene with wonder. He'd lived alone so long, he'd forgotten what joy sounded like. The women's laughter, the casual chatter, the way they moved around each other in the small space with easy familiarity. It filled something in him he hadn't known was empty. As they gathered around the table, Ruth proudly serving portions of her rabbit, Jedediah felt moisture gathering in his eyes. He blinked hard, hoping no one noticed, but Dinah caught his gaze and gave him a gentle smile of understanding. "Shall we say grace?" Hattie asked, her voice slightly hoarse. She'd been fighting a cold for a few days but insisted she was fine. They joined hands around the table, heads bowed as Hattie led them in prayer. Her words of gratitude for their growing family brought more moisture to Jedediah's eyes, but this time he didn't try to hide it. The meal was simple but felt like a celebration. They shared stories and jokes. The rabbit declared the finest any had tasted. Even Jedediah found himself joining in the conversation more than usual, drawn out by their warmth. As they were clearing the dishes, Hattie swayed suddenly, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I feel rather." She didn't finish the sentence before her knees buckled. Jedediah lunged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. Her skin burned against his hands. "Mama!" her son cried out, rushing forward but held back by Mary Beth. "She's burning up," Jedediah said, lifting Hattie easily and carrying her to the bed in the corner. The women hurried to help, bringing water and cool cloths. "She's been coughing for days," Clara said worriedly, touching Hattie's flushed face. "I thought it was just a cold." Hattie shivered violently despite the cabin's warmth, her breathing labored and rough. Panic spread through the room like wildfire. "I'm going for Doc Wilkins," Jedediah announced, already reaching for his coat. "Mary Beth, you're in charge. Keep her warm and try to get water in her if she wakes." He rushed out into the gathering dusk, hitching the horses to the wagon with practiced speed. The temperature had dropped sharply, and new snow was starting to fall. He urged the horses faster than was strictly safe on the dark trail, but fear drove him forward. Doc Wilkins lived on the outskirts of town, and Jedediah's pounding on his door brought the older man shuffling out in his nightshirt. Hattie Wilson's took bad sick. Jedediah explained quickly. "High fever, shaking something fierce." The doctor didn't waste time with questions, gathering his supplies and climbing into the wagon. The return journey seemed to take forever, though Jedediah pushed the horses as hard as he dared in the darkness. They found the cabin blazing with lamplight. The women had moved Hattie's son to another bed, and they hovered anxiously as Doc Wilkins examined their friend. "How long has she been coughing?" he asked, pressing his ear to her chest. "About a week," Clara answered. "It seemed like just a cold at first." The doctor's face grew grave as he continued his examination. Finally, he straightened up with a heavy sigh. "Her lungs are congested," he announced. "Could be pneumonia setting in. She'll need constant care, keeping her warm, helping her clear her lungs, plenty of water and broth when she can take it." He turned to Jedediah. "If her breathing gets worse, or the fever spikes higher, come for me again immediately." He left them with detailed instructions and medicines, but his worried expression said more than his words. As soon as he left, the women organized themselves into nursing shifts. Mary Beth and Clara took the first watch, while Dinah prepared a Cherokee tea she said would help with fever. Jedediah found himself by Hattie's bedside, his large hands clasped together, lips moving in silent prayer. He wasn't eloquent with words, but he poured his heart into simple pleading. "Lord, please spare her. These women need her. Her boy needs her." Hours crept by. The women moved quietly around the cabin, tending to Hattie, comforting her son, maintaining the fire. Jedediah couldn't bring himself to leave her bedside except when absolutely necessary. He sat in the straight-backed chair, watching her labored breathing, his prayers continuing without cease. Dawn approached, and still Hattie burned with fever. Ruth brought Jedediah coffee, touching his shoulder gently. "You should rest," she suggested softly. He shook his head. "Can't. Made a promise to protect you all. Should have noticed she was getting sick sooner." "You can't blame yourself," Ruth said firmly, surprising him with her conviction. "We're all watching over her now. That's what family does." Family. The word echoed in his heart as he looked around the cabin. These women had become so much more than guests seeking shelter. They had become his responsibility, his comfort, his family. And now, one of them lay fighting for breath, while he sat helpless except for prayer. The night's joy over Ruth's rabbit seemed a lifetime ago. But as Jedediah watched the women working together to care for Hattie, he saw the same strength that had helped them survive rejection and find new purpose. They would fight for Hattie with everything they had, and he would fight alongside them. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Inside the cabin, 7 women and 1 mountain man kept vigil, their prayers rising like smoke from the hearth, their hearts beating as one with hope and fear for their beloved friend. The night crept forward with agonizing slowness. In the dim cabin, Illuminated only by the glow of the hearth and a single oil lamp, the women took turns caring for Hattie. Her fever still raged, making her toss and turn beneath the quilts they'd piled over. Her shivering form. Clara wrung out a cloth in cool water, placing it gently on Hattie's burning forehead. "Peace, be still," she whispered, echoing the words of scripture. Beside her, Dinah hummed softly, a melody that seemed to float in the air like a prayer. Mary Beth began singing in her clear, steady voice. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." One by one, the other women joined in, their harmonies weaving together in the darkness. Even Hattie's son, who refused to leave his mother's side, added his small voice to the chorus. Outside, Jedediah paced through the falling snow, his boots leaving deep tracks that were quickly filled by fresh powder. The cold bit through his coat, but he welcomed it, needed it to clear his head. Every few minutes, he'd pause to stare at the cabin's warm windows, straining to hear if anything had changed. The thought of Hattie dying under his roof haunted him. He'd promised these women shelter, protection. What good was his strength, his knowledge of survival, if he couldn't keep them safe from illness? His breath came out in frustrated clouds as he continued his relentless pacing. Ruth appeared at the door, wrapped in a shawl. "Jedediah, you'll freeze out here." He shook his head, unable to put his fears into words. The cabin felt too small, too close, with death hovering so near. Out here, at least he could move, could do something, even if that something was just wearing a path in the snow. "She's fighting," Ruth said softly. "We're all fighting with her. Come inside and fight with us." Jedediah hesitated, then followed her back into the warmth. The women's voices had shifted to another hymn, one his mother used to sing. Without thinking, he found himself humming along as he took up his position near the hearth. Through the long hours, they maintained their vigil. Abigail read passages from her worn Bible by lamplight. Eliza heated broth, coaxing spoonfuls between Hattie's cracked lips whenever she stirred. Dinah brewed more of her medicinal tea, its pungent aroma filling the cabin. The first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Mary Beth, exhausted from her watch, noticed a change in Hattie's breathing. Where it had been shallow and labored, now it seemed deeper, more regular. She pressed a hand to Hattie's forehead. "The fever's breaking," she announced, her voice trembling with relief. Everyone gathered around the bed. True enough, Hattie's skin felt cooler to the touch, and her face had lost its alarming flush. As they watched, her eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on their concerned faces. "My dears," she whispered hoarsely, managing a weak smile. "Have you been singing all night?" Her son burst into tears, burying his face in her shoulder. The women weren't far behind, their eyes filling with grateful tears. Jedediah stood back, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. Relief flooded through the cabin like a physical presence. The tension that had held them rigid all night drained away, leaving them swaying with exhaustion. They helped Hattie drink some broth and made her comfortable before collapsing into chairs or onto pallets. "We should pray," Mary Beth suggested, though she could barely keep her eyes open. They joined hands in a circle around Hattie's bed, their words of gratitude mixing with yawns, but no less heartfelt for their weariness. As morning light filled the cabin, they took turns sleeping and tending to necessary tasks. Jedediah went out to care for the animals and bring in more firewood, his movements mechanical with fatigue. When he returned, he found Mary Beth waiting with a cup of coffee. "You need rest too," she said, pressing the cup into his hands. He accepted it but remained standing, something heavy clearly weighing on his mind. The others were either sleeping or busy with quiet tasks, creating a moment of relative privacy. "I feared I'd led you all into ruin," he confessed suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Taking you in, thinking I could protect you." He stared into his coffee, shoulders hunched. "I've never had family. I don't know how to keep one alive." Mary Beth's hand touched his arm, firm and steady. "You're not alone now," she said with quiet conviction. "We're here, and we're staying as long as God wills it." "All of us," added Clara, who had approached quietly. The other women stirred, adding their voices in agreement. Even Hattie from her bed smiled and nodded. Jedediah had to swallow hard several times before he could speak. "Thank you," he managed, his voice breaking on the words. "Thank you all." As evening approached, Hattie had regained enough strength to sit up, propped against pillows. Her son curled beside her, unwilling to leave her side. The others gathered around the fire, sharing the simple supper Eliza had prepared. Abigail brought out her Bible again, but this time, instead of reading alone, she passed it to Ruth. "Shall we each take a turn?" Ruth nodded, carefully finding her place. Her voice, usually hesitant, grew stronger as she read the familiar words of comfort. When she finished, she passed the Bible to Dinah, who chose a psalm of thanksgiving. Around the circle they went, each selecting passages that spoke to their hearts. Even Jedediah, when his turn came, managed to read a few verses, though he had to clear his throat several times to get through them. The firelight played across their faces as they listened to each other, casting a warm glow that seemed to mirror the feeling in their hearts. They were no longer 7 displaced women and a solitary mountain man. They had become something more, a family, bound together by choice and faith in the trials they'd faced together. As Mary Beth read the final passage of the evening, her clear voice carried the weight of promise. "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire and feeling the truth of those words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, illness, rejection from the town, the threat to their water rights, they would face them together, as one household under God's care. Hattie's soft voice rose from her bed, starting another hymn. One by one they joined in, their voices blending in the gathering darkness. Even Jedediah found himself singing quietly, no longer self-conscious about his rough baritone. The snow had stopped falling outside, and stars began to appear in the clear sky. Inside the cabin, the warmth of shared purpose and answered prayers wrapped around them like a blanket, stronger than any winter cold could challenge. The news of Hattie's illness spread through town like wildfire. By Sunday morning, the wooden pews of the church buzzed with whispered conversations. Women bent their heads together, speaking behind gloved hands, while casting furtive glances toward the back of the church where Jedediah and his household Saturday. "Did you hear? The widow woman nearly died." Judgment from above, if you ask me. Living under one roof with a man not their husband. Jedediah's jaw tightened as he caught fragments of their words. He sat straighter, his broad shoulders forming a protective wall between the gossips and the women beside him. Hattie, still weak but determined to attend service, kept her eyes fixed forward, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Her son pressed closer to her side. Reverend Silas Harper strode to the pulpit, his black coat severe against the whitewashed walls. His stern gaze swept over the congregation, lingering meaningfully on Jedediah's group. The mountain man met his look steadily, refusing to flinch. "Brothers and sisters," Silas began, his voice carrying to the rafters. "We gather today to consider the wages of sin." He slammed his hand down on the pulpit. "When we harbor iniquity, we invite God's judgment." Several heads nodded in agreement. Mary Beth's spine stiffened, but she continued holding her hymnal with dignity. "Consider the household that defies proper order," Silas continued, his words sharp as arrows. "Consider those who mock the sanctity of marriage by living in alternative arrangements." His lips curled around the words. Is it any wonder when sickness falls upon such a house? Dinah's dark eyes flashed with anger, but she remained silent. Clara reached over to squeeze her hand. Jedediah's knuckles went white where they gripped the pew in front of him. "Let this be a warning," Silas declared, "to all who would stray from righteous paths." After service, Jedediah hurried his household out before anyone could confront them. The winter air bit at their faces as they climbed into the wagon, a blessed relief after the stifling atmosphere inside the church. "Don't let it trouble you," Jedediah said gruffly as they rode home. "Their words can't harm us." "But they do harm," Hattie replied softly. "They poison minds against us." Before Jedediah could respond, they crested the hill overlooking his creek. His hands tightened on the reins at what he saw below. 3 men in smart coats were walking along the bank, stopping every few yards to hammer wooden stakes into the frozen ground. "Stay here," he ordered, jumping down from the wagon. His boots crunched through snow as he strode toward the men, anger building with each step. "This is private property," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the water. The men looked up, seemingly unsurprised by his appearance. The tallest, wearing a bowler hat, gave him an oily smile. "Ah, Mr. Kane, just the man we needed to see." "You're trespassing," Jedediah stated flatly. "On the contrary." The man pulled a folded document from his coat. "The Colorado Western Railroad has filed claim to this water right. We're simply surveying for the new line. This creek's been in my family 30 years. Jedediah's voice was deadly quiet. "I've got the deed to prove it." The man's smile didn't waver. "Courts tend to favor progress, Mr. Kane. Railroads mean civilization. Surely you understand." "What I understand is that you're on my land without permission." Jedediah took a step forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the shorter man. The railroad man's smile finally slipped. He took a quick step back, nearly stumbling over a stake. "Now, see here." "No, you see here." Jedediah pointed toward his cabin. "That creek waters my stock and feeds my household. I won't have you stealing it with fancy papers." "The courts will decide that," the man snapped, his pretense of friendliness gone. "And they'll side with progress, mark my words." He gestured to his companions. "Come on, boys. We've marked enough for today." Jedediah watched them go, his heart heavy despite his show of strength. When he returned to the wagon, the women's faces showed they'd heard everything. "What can we do?" Ruth asked anxiously. "First, we get home," Jedediah replied, climbing back into the driver's seat. "Then we look at that deed." Back in the cabin's warmth, Jedediah retrieved an old tin box from beneath a floorboard. His hands were gentle as he lifted out a yellow document, carefully unfolding it on the table. The women gathered around as he smoothed the creases. "My father's hand," he said softly, pointing to the signature at the bottom. He filed it proper with the territory office in 58. Abigail adjusted her spectacles, studying the faded writing. "This is legal proof, then?" "Should be," Jedediah frowned. "But railroad men have clever lawyers. They'll try to find holes in it." "Then we must seek legal help," Mary Beth declared firmly. "Surely there's a lawyer in Denver who would take our case." "Winter's a bad time for travel," Jedediah mused. "Passes might be blocked for weeks yet." Clara leaned forward, examining the deed more closely. "We could copy it," she suggested. "Make several versions in case anything happens to the original." "I can help with that," Eliza offered. "My penmanship was praised at school." One by one, the women volunteered their skills. Dinah would prepare fresh ink. Ruth knew how to treat paper to prevent smudging. Even Hattie, still recovering, offered to check their work against the original. Jedediah watched in amazement as they organized themselves, setting up a workspace at the table. Clara carefully mixed ink while Eliza prepared sheets of paper. Dinah held the original deed flat, reading out the words in her clear voice while others took turns copying. Their dedication brought a lump to his throat. These women, who had every reason to feel defeated by the town's rejection, instead faced each new challenge with determination and grace. Pride swelled in his chest as he watched them work, their heads bent together in concentration. "We'll need to send letters to Denver," Mary Beth said, looking up from her copying. "Explain our situation to any lawyer who might help." "The mail rider won't come through until the weather breaks," Jedediah replied. "Then we'll have the letters ready and waiting," she said firmly. "We won't let them take your creek, Jedediah. Not without a fight." He nodded, touched by their fierce loyalty. "Our creek," he corrected quietly. "It waters all our stock now." The women exchanged warm glances at his words. They worked well into the evening, making multiple copies of the deed in careful script. When they finally finished, Jedediah stored the original back in its tin box while the copies were tied with ribbon and stored safely in different locations. "They won't find it easy to steal from this family," Ruth declared. her usual shyness forgotten in determination. Family. The word echoed in Jedediah's mind as he looked around at these brave women who had become so much more than unexpected guests. Whatever the railroad men planned, whatever the town might whisper, he knew they would face it together. Outside, the stakes along the creek stood like silent sentinels in the gathering dusk. But inside the cabin, warm lamplight fell on bent heads and determined faces as they began drafting their letters to Denver. The scratch of pens on paper filled the quiet air, each word a declaration that they would not be moved from the home they had built together. The January days stretched long and cold across the Colorado highlands. Fresh snow piled in deep drifts around Jedediah's cabin, turning the world into a sea of white, broken only by the dark line of trees and the ribbon of partly frozen creek below. Inside, life settled into familiar rhythms despite the harsh weather. On this particular morning, Ruth stood beside Jedediah at the woodpile, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air. She gripped the axe handle uncertainly, remembering her early failures. "Like this?" she asked, positioning her feet the way he'd shown her. Jedediah nodded. "Keep your stance wide. Let the weight of the axe do the work." Ruth lifted the tool, bringing it down with determination. The log split with a satisfying crack. A bright smile lit her face as she turned to Jedediah. "I did it!" "Fine work," he agreed, his gruff voice carrying genuine pride. "You've come far since those first tries." Ruth gathered the split pieces, adding them to their growing pile. Her movements were more confident now, far from the clumsy attempts of weeks past. "I never thought I'd learn such things," she admitted. "Back home, they said I was too simple to master real skills." "Ain't nothing simple about you," Jedediah replied firmly. "Just needed someone to show you proper is all." Inside the cabin, Clara sat by the window taking advantage of the morning light as she mended a torn shirt. Her needle moved in precise, careful stitches. Around her, the main room had transformed over the weeks. What was once a sparse bachelor's dwelling now showed signs of feminine touch. Dried herbs hanging from rafters, neat stacks of dishes on shelves, even a patch of calico covering a Preussen rough table. Hattie emerged from the back room, moving slowly but steadily. Her illness had left her weak, but each day brought more strength. She carried a basket of dried vegetables, setting it near the hearth. "Thinking we might have something special for supper," she said, sorting through the preserved food. "To celebrate being well enough to cook again." Clara looked up from her sewing. "That would be lovely. I saved some dried apples that could make a fine pie." "Pie?" Ruth's voice came eagerly as she entered, arms full of firewood. "I haven't had pie since leaving home." The word spread quickly among the women. Soon they were all gathered around the table, planning their feast. Mary Beth contributed cornmeal for bread, while Dinah offered to prepare the rabbit meat in a rich stew. Eliza remembered her mother's secret for making gravy, and Abigail knew how to fashion candles from saved tallow. "But don't tell Jedediah," Marybeth instructed as he headed out to check his trap lines. "Let's make it a proper surprise." Throughout the afternoon, the cabin filled with purposeful activity. Hattie directed operations from her chair, her color better than it had been in weeks. The scent of baking bread mingled with simmering stew. Clara and Eliza worked together on the pie, carefully rolling out crust, while Ruth watched in fascination. "Never knew so much went into making things taste good," she marveled. "Food's more than just filling bellies," Hattie explained. "It's how we show care for each other, make a house feel like home." By late afternoon, the table was transformed. A clean sheet served as tablecloth, set with their best tin plates and cups. Candles stood ready in holders made from carved potatoes, Dinah's clever solution. The pie cooled on the windowsill, golden brown and fragrant. When Jedediah's heavy steps sounded on the porch, everyone rushed to their places. He pushed open the door, snow falling from his coat, and stopped short at the sight before him. Lamplight gleamed on the carefully arranged table, faces beaming in welcome. "What's all this?" he asked, clearly stunned. "Surprise!" Ruth couldn't contain her excitement. "We made a proper feast." To thank you, Clara added more sedately, for all you've done for us. And to celebrate being together, Hattie finished, her gentle smile warming the room. Jedediah stood frozen, his expression a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. Finally, he removed his coat with deliberate care. "Ain't never come home to such a welcome," he said gruffly. They gathered around the table, an odd family bound by circumstance and growing affection. Mary Beth said grace, her words touching on gratitude for shelter, healing, and unexpected blessings. Then they fell to eating with enthusiasm. The rabbit stew was rich with vegetables and dumplings, the cornbread hot and fragrant. Conversation flowed easily now, so different from their first awkward meals together. Ruth described her woodcutting triumph, while Clara shared stories from her teaching days. Dinah taught them a Cherokee word for family that meant those who share the fire. When the pie was served, Jedediah took his first bite with visible emotion. "Tastes like childhood," he said softly. "My mother used to make apple pie before she passed." A comfortable silence fell as they savored the dessert. Outside, wind whistled through pine trees and snow continued to fall, but inside was all warmth and contentment. After the dishes were cleared, Dinah started a hymn in her clear voice. One by one, the others joined in, their voices blending in familiar harmony. They looked expectantly at Jedediah, who usually just listened. This time, though, he cleared his throat and added his deep bass to the chorus. His voice cracked on the high notes, and he was clearly unsure of some words, but he persevered. When the song ended, the women burst into delighted applause. "Well done," Mary Beth exclaimed. "You're officially part of our choir. Now." "Reckon I am," Jedediah agreed, reddening but pleased. They sang several more songs together, teaching Jedediah the words when he faltered. His voice grew more confident with each attempt, though still endearingly rough around the edges. Ruth clapped in rhythm while Clara kept them on key, and even Hattie joined in despite her lingering weakness. As evening deepened, they gradually drifted to their sleeping places, the women to their arranged corners, Jedediah to his small back room. But before retiring, he stepped outside one last time, ostensibly to check the weather. Under the vast starry sky, Jedediah Kane knelt in the snow. His prayer was simple but heartfelt, thanking God for sending him the family he never knew he needed. The warmth of the evening still glowed in his chest, a feeling so foreign he hardly knew what to call it. Inside, he could hear the women's soft voices as they prepared for bed. The cabin that had known decades of silence now held whispered conversations, gentle laughter, and the quiet sounds of people who belonged together. Jedediah brushed snow from his knees as he stood, his breath frosted in the cold air as he whispered one final thanks, not for shelter or safety or even the good meal, but for the miracle of emptiness filled, tie of loneliness, transformed into something rich and strange and wonderful. When he returned inside, the main room was lit only by the dying fire, but it was a darkness full of peaceful breathing, of shared dreams, of hope. Jedediah made his way to his bunk, his heavy steps softened by happiness. Through the small window, moonlight painted silver stripes across the cabin floor. In that gentle glow, the worn furniture and rough-hewn walls seemed transformed. This was no longer just a shelter from the wilderness, but a true home, blessed by laughter and song and the sweet taste of apple pie. Sleep came easily that night, wrapped in the warmth of belonging. Outside, the wind might howl, and snow might drift, deep against the walls, but inside Jedediah's cabin, 7 women and 1 mountain man had found what they never expected, a family forged in winter's heart, stronger than blood, bound by choice and love and faith. The telegraph operator's rapid clicks echoed through the small depot office early that morning. Jedediah stood waiting, boots leaving puddles of melted snow on the worn floorboards. The young operator's face grew serious as he decoded the message, his pencil scratching against paper. "Message from Denver. Mr. Kane," he said, holding out the telegram with a sympathetic look. "Railroad lawyers arriving next week." Jedediah's weathered hands took the paper, his eyes scanning the brief message. Outside, wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow as townspeople went about their business. Through the depot window, he could see women in fine dresses hurrying past, turning their faces away when they caught sight of him. The whispers had grown louder lately. Scandal, they called it. Disgrace. One word caught his ear as he stepped onto the boardwalk. Hoarder. A group of men outside the mercantile muttered it, watching him with narrowed eyes. Hoarding women, one said loud enough to carry. Keeping 7 good wives from decent men. Jedediah's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. The telegram crinkled in his pocket with each step. Back at the wagon, he found Mary Beth waiting with supplies they'd come to purchase. Her face clouded when she saw his expression. Bad news? She asked quietly. Lawyer's coming, he replied, helping her up onto the wagon seat. Railroad means to take the creek, proper or not. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking through fresh snow. Finally, Mary Beth spoke. Sunday tomorrow. Will you still take us to church? Jedediah nodded slowly. Ain't right to let fear keep us from worship. Dawn broke clear and cold that Sunday morning. The women dressed in their best, though their clothes showed wear from months of travel. Dinah wore a dress she'd carefully mended, proud Cherokee beadwork at the collar. Hattie, still pale from her illness, insisted on coming despite her weakness. The wagon drew stairs as they approached the white-painted church. Jedediah helped each woman down, ignoring the shocked looks from other arriving families. They filed into the back pew, heads held high despite the murmurs that rippled through the sanctuary. Reverend Silas stood at the pulpit, his sermon notes trembling slightly as he began. His eyes kept straying to their pew, losing his place several times. The morning scripture reading spoke of caring for widows and strangers, words that hung heavy in the air. As the final hymn ended, Jedediah knew what was coming. A group of town leaders lingered by the door, their wives whispering behind gloved hands. As his household stepped out into the winter sunshine, they found their path blocked. This has gone on long enough, Kane, Marcus Fletcher, the bank owner, declared. It's not proper. One man keeping 7 women under his roof. People are talking. Let them talk, Jedediah said quietly. It's scandalous. Mrs. Fletcher burst out. These women need proper homes, proper husbands. They have a proper home. Jedediah's voice carried across the churchyard, stronger now. Other families stopped to listen. They're my household, under my protection. They deserve honor, not shame. His hands were trembling, but his stance was firm. The women gathered closer behind him, a united front. Reverend Silas emerged from the church, hesitating on the steps as he saw the confrontation. Reverend, Fletcher appealed. Surely you have something to say about this arrangement? All eyes turned to the preacher. He looked from the angry townspeople to Jedediah's steady gaze, then to the proud faces of the 7 women. His shoulders slumped slightly. He began, then stopped. The silence stretched uncomfortable. Finally, he straightened. I see no sin in offering shelter to those in need. A murmur ran through the crowd. It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was enough. The tension began to ease. Fletcher's wife huffed and turned away, drawing others with her. Gradually, the churchyard cleared. Jedediah helped the women back into the wagon, his movements gentle despite his large hands. As they drove home, Hattie reached out to touch his arm. Thank you, she said simply. The others nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. But Jedediah needed solitude to settle his heart. After helping the women down at the cabin, he walked alone to the creek. The water still ran free beneath winter ice, its music a comfort he'd known since childhood. Here, where his father had first taught him to fish, he knelt in the snow. Lord, he prayed aloud, his voice rough with emotion, I ain't never asked for much, but these women. He paused, searching for words. They need someone to stand for them. Give me strength to be that man. The creek whispered its answer, constant and sure. Wind stirred the pine branches overhead, shaking loose small showers of snow. Jedediah remained kneeling until his legs grew numb and his breath frosted thick in his beard. When he finally returned to the cabin, the smell of fresh bread greeted him. The women had been busy during his absence. Clara and Ruth had kneaded and shaped the dough, while Dinah tended the fire to keep it just right for baking. Eliza and Abigail had cleaned until the cabin fairly sparkled, and Mary Beth had organized their stores for the coming week. Hattie sat in her chair by the fire, a quilt across her lap as she directed the younger women in their tasks. She smiled warmly at Jedediah's entrance. "We were wondering when you'd return," she said. "Bread's almost ready." "Smells like heaven," he replied, stamping snow from his boots. "We want you to know," Mary Beth spoke up, wiping flour from her hands, "that we're not running. Not now, not ever, unless you send us away." The other women voiced their agreement. Dinah stepped forward, her dark eyes serious. "You called us your household today," she said. "Did you mean it?" "Every word," Jedediah answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Then we're family," she declared firmly. "Cherokee no family isn't just blood. It's who you choose to stand beside." Ruth broke the solemn moment by announcing the bread was ready. Soon they were gathered around the table, steam rising from fresh-cut slices slathered with precious butter. The women chattered about the day, their voices comfortable and familiar in the cabin's warmth. Jedediah ate quietly, watching them with wonder. The telegram still waited in his pocket, its threat momentarily forgotten. Whatever came with those lawyers, he knew now he wouldn't face it alone. These women, this unlikely family, would stand with him. As if reading his thoughts, Abigail spoke up suddenly. "We'll help you fight for the creek," she said, her usual stammer absent in her determination. "It's our home too now." The others nodded firmly. Even Hattie straightened in her chair, color rising in her pale cheeks. "God brought us here for a reason," she said. "Maybe this is part of it." Jedediah looked around the table at each face. Mary Beth's quiet strength, Clara's gentle wisdom, Ruth's fierce loyalty, Eliza's practical courage, Abigail's determined spirit, Dinah's proud resilience, and Hattie's maternal warmth. These were the women the town had rejected as unsuitable. Yet here they sat, transformed by months of shared hardship and growing trust into something remarkable. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of his heart. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady. Inside Jedediah's cabin, the light of lanterns and fireplace cast warm shadows on the walls. The bread was passed around a second time, conversation flowing easy and natural. No one mentioned the coming legal battle or the town's disapproval. For now, it was enough to be together, bound by choice and circumstance into something stronger than either. The telegram could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for celebrating the simple victory of standing firm, of declaring their unity to the world. Tonight was for fresh bread and quiet joy, for the comfort of belonging, for the peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. As darkness settled over the Colorado highlands, the cabin glowed like a beacon. Inside, 7 women and 1 mountain man had forged something the townsfolk couldn't understand. A family built on respect and trust, rather than convention. The sound of their voices mingled with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of falling snow, creating a harmony sweeter than any church hymn. The morning brought 3 railroad lawyers to town, their polished boots and city suits stark against the muddy street. They strode into the courthouse carrying leather portfolios stuffed with papers, their faces set with grim determination. Jedediah received the summons that afternoon. Ruth spotted the messenger riding up and called everyone to the door. They gathered behind Jedediah as he read the formal document, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "They're contesting the deed," he said quietly. "Say my father's claim wasn't properly recorded. They'll seize the land in 30 days if we can't prove otherwise." "They can't do that," Clara burst out. "We've worked too hard here." Mary Beth stepped forward, her face set with resolve. "Then we'll fight them. Every one of us has seen how this land sustains life. We'll testify to that." The other women nodded firmly. That very afternoon, they began keeping detailed records. Dinah crafted a leather-bound notebook, and each woman took turns documenting their work. They wrote about the garden they'd planted, the repairs they'd made to the cabin, the ways they'd improved the land. Every stitch, every seed, every improvement matters, Mary Beth insisted as she wrote. It shows we're not just squatting here, we're building something lasting. Jedediah watched them work with quiet amazement. These women who'd arrived desperate at his door now stood ready to defend their home with fierce determination. Later that evening, while the others prepared supper, Mary Beth found Jedediah alone by the creek. She settled beside him on a fallen log, her skirts rustling against the dried grass. "May I tell you something?" she asked softly. When he nodded, she continued. "Back east, I was to be married. Everything was ready, the church, the dress, the guests, but he never came." Her voice caught, just left me standing there waiting. Said later I wasn't the kind of wife he needed. Jedediah's hands tightened on his knees, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "I thought my life was over that day," she admitted. "What worth could I have if the man I'd given my heart to found me wanting?" "He was wrong," Jedediah said, his deep voice gentle as summer rain. "Your worth ain't in any man's judgment of you. It's in how you carry yourself with dignity, how you lead these women with grace, how you face each day with courage." Mary Beth's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, clasping his rough hand briefly in her soft one. Jedediah's face flushed red, but he didn't pull away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing us, seeing me, as worthy." The moment held, tender as a spring bud, then passed as voices called them in for supper. But something had shifted, like ice breaking in a spring thaw. That evening, as darkness settled over the cabin, Hattie began singing "Amazing Grace." One by one, the other women joined in, their voices growing stronger with each verse. Jedediah sat in his chair by the fire, watching as they lifted their faces, unafraid. The hymn swelled, pushing back against the shadows, against the threat of loss, against every voice that had ever told them they weren't enough. Clara's alto wove, beneath Eliza's clear soprano, while Ruth and Abigail held the melody. Dinah added harmonies she'd learned from her Cherokee mother, and Hattie's voice soared above them all. Mary Beth caught Jedediah's eye across the room. Her smile was gentle, but her spine was straight as a pine tree. They would face whatever came together, this unlikely family bound by choice and circumstance. Outside, snow began falling again. But inside the cabin, 7 women sang their defiance against fear, their voices echoing off the rough-hewn walls. Their home might be threatened, but their spirits stood unshaken, strengthened by the acceptance they'd found in this place, with this quiet mountain man who'd seen their true worth when all others turned away. The hymn ended, but its warmth lingered in the air like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight they had each other, and that was enough. 3 weeks of anxious waiting passed before the court summons arrived. Frost painted the windows as Jedediah read the official notice aloud. The women gathered around the kitchen table, their faces set with determination. "We're coming with you," Mary Beth declared, already reaching for her shawl. The others nodded firmly. "All of you?" Jedediah asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Every last one," Ruth affirmed. "We're in this together." They loaded into the wagon, huddling close against the biting wind. Ice crusted the wheel rims as they made their slow way into town. Dinah passed out the extra blankets she'd sewn, while Clara led them in quiet hymns to keep their spirits up. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Mr. Brackett stood near the front, his silk vest gleaming as he whispered to his lawyers. When he spotted Jedediah and the women filing in, his lips curled into a mocking smile. The proceedings began with legal arguments that made Jedediah's head spin. But when called upon, he stepped forward steadily, producing his father's deed and the signatures of 3 witnesses who'd helped survey the land years ago. Then, one by one, the women rose. Though they hadn't been asked to speak, their presence spoke volumes. They stood straight-backed and dignified, 7 pairs of eyes meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. The judge, a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles, studied the documents carefully before announcing his decision. Final ruling would wait until spring review, when surveyors could properly examine the creek boundaries. Disappointment settled heavy in Jedediah's chest as he helped the women back into the wagon. But that evening, he lit every lamp in the cabin, pushing back the darkness that threatened to overwhelm them. They gathered in a circle, hands linked, and prayed for strength to endure until spring's verdict. "The Lord will provide," Hattie whispered, and 7 voices echoed, "Amen." The first warm breeze of March stirred the melting snow. Creek waters swelled with spring thaw, rushing past the cabin with renewed vigor. Outside, hope bloomed alongside the first green shoots pushing through the soil. "Look here," Ruth called, holding up a handful of dark earth. Perfect for planting. The women had cleared a patch near the cabin's south wall, and now they worked together, dropping seeds into neat rows. Mary Beth marked the plots with wooden stakes, while Clara and Dinah scattered precious vegetable seeds they'd saved from winter stores. Up on the roof, Jedediah's hammer rang steady as he replaced weather-worn shingles. He paused, watching 3 children from town approach shyly. Hattie emerged from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands. "Would you young ones like some fresh bread?" she called warmly. The children's faces lit up as they scampered closer. Soon, more youngsters began appearing at odd hours, drawn by the scent of baking and the women's gentle welcome. Words spread through town of the kindness found at Jedediah's cabin. Whispers turned from scandal to wonder at how the unusual household flourished. One Sunday afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the yard, Reverend Silas Harper appeared at their gate. His shoulders stooped, hat clutched in his hands. "Brother Cain," he said, voice rough with emotion, "I come, seeking forgiveness for my harsh judgment. I see now how God's hand moves in ways we cannot fathom. Your household shows more Christian charity than my rigid sermons ever did." Jedediah clasped the preacher's hand. "We're all God's children learning his ways." That evening, they celebrated with song. Abigail's clear voice led the hymns while Dinah taught them a Cherokee melody of thanksgiving. Their joined voices carried across the valley, a testament to hearts united in grace. The letter arrived on a sun-washed morning. Jedediah's hands trembled as he broke the courthouse seal. His eyes scanned the formal writing, then grew wide. "The judge," his voice caught. "He upheld our deed. The creek stays with us." For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Then Mary Beth let out a joyful cry that broke the spell. The women rushed forward, embracing each other as tears flowed freely. Hattie grabbed her shawl and danced with little Ruth, while Clara and Abigail clutched hands in prayer. Jedediah stood rooted, watching their celebration with misty eyes. His gaze swept over each face that had become so dear to him these past months. "I need to say something," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion. The women gathered close, sensing his earnestness. "Maribeth, your strength led us. Eliza, your cooking kept us fed. Ruth, your determination inspired us. Clara, your prayers upheld us. Abigail, your gentle spirit blessed us. Dinah, your wisdom guided us. And Hattie," he paused, swallowing hard, "your songs gave us hope." He squared his shoulders, looking at each woman in turn. "This victory belongs to all of us. And I vow here and now, you'll always have a home beneath this roof, unless you choose to leave it." "We're not going anywhere," Mary Beth declared firmly, the others nodding in agreement. "You're our protector now, Jedediah Cain, our brother in Christ and, for some of us, the only father we've known." As evening settled over the valley, they lit every lamp in the cabin. Their voices rose in hymns of thanksgiving, joy spilling from the windows in golden light. Jedediah joined the singing, his heart so full it ached. For the first time since his father's passing 20 years ago, he felt truly at peace. He was no longer a solitary man, but the head of a family bound by choice and love. Summer painted the Colorado highlands in rich greens and golds. Where Jedediah's lonely shack once stood, a proper homestead now sprawled across the hillside. Fresh-cut timber marked new additions, bedrooms, and a larger kitchen built by willing hands over the seasons. From his carved rocking chair on the wide front porch, Jedediah watched life unfold before him. 3 young boys, orphans they'd taken in last winter, chased each other through tall grass. Their laughter carried on the warm breeze. Near the garden, Clara walked with her new husband Thomas, their infant daughter cradled in her arms. Ruth's twins gathered wildflowers while their father mended fence posts nearby. The steady thump of Jedediah's carving knife shaped wood beneath his weathered hands. He was crafting another cradle, the 4th this year. The Lord had blessed their household abundantly. Coffee? Maribeth's voice was warm as she appeared beside him, offering a steaming cup. Much obliged. He smiled, setting aside his work. Her presence brought the same quiet joy it always had, steady as the mountains themselves. Across the yard, Dinah called out instructions to Hattie about the quilting they'd stretched between poles. Abigail's clear voice rang from the kitchen window as she sang while kneading bread. The afternoon wind carried the mixed sounds of their bustling household women's voices, children's play, men's work, and the soft, lowing of cattle in the nearby pasture. As dusk painted the sky in purple and gold, the extended family gathered at the long table they'd built together. Elbows bumped companionably as 23 souls squeezed in close. The room glowed with lamplight, faces bright with joy and belonging. Jedediah rose at the head of the table, his massive frame casting a gentle shadow. The room settled into reverent quiet as he bowed his head to pray. Lord, his voice carried clear and steady, no longer shy with emotion. You answered my prayers not with solitude's end, but with family's beginning. You turned my loneliness into abundance, my shame into purpose. Thank you for each soul gathered here, for making us one household in your sight. Amen, they echoed warmly. Through the windows, their home shone like a beacon across the darkening valley. Within its walls, love had transformed 7 rejected women and 1 solitary man into something beautiful, a testament to mercy's power to heal and redeem. The evening filled with the comfortable sounds of shared meals and gentle teasing, of children being tucked into bed, of quiet conversations on the porch. Jedediah sat in his rocker, watching the stars emerge, his heart at perfect peace. God had given him not just purpose, but legacy, a family that would carry forward his example of defending the vulnerable and choosing love over judgment. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.